Racist boss fires black employee. Then Oprah steps in to teach him a lesson. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. James adjusted his tie, staring at his reflection in the mirror of his office. He was a man who had built his company from the ground up, priding himself on being efficient and professional. But today, his patience was wearing thin. There was a knock at his door, and without looking up, he barked, "Come in." Marcus entered, shoulders squared, carrying the monthly financial reports. He had been with the company for 3 years, always punctual, always meticulous in his work. But today there was tension in the air. He placed the documents on James' desk and stood back. "The numbers for last quarter," he said evenly. James picked up the folder, flipping through it. He muttered, skimming over the data. His expression darkened. "These figures aren't what I was expecting, Marcus. We're down in sales." Marcus nodded. "Yes, but if you turn to page 3, you'll see the market trend. Our competitors are seeing the same dip due to..." James waved a dismissive hand. "I don't need excuses. I need results." Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his voice level. "I understand that, sir. But the projections show that, with our current trajectory, we should see an increase next quarter." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had always been skeptical of Marcus. It wasn't his work was solid. It was just something else. Maybe it was the way Marcus carried himself, confident but never submissive. James didn't like that. "I'm not sure this position is the right fit for you anymore," James said suddenly, watching for a reaction. Marcus stiffened. "Excuse me?" James set the folder down and folded his hands on the desk. "I've been thinking about restructuring. Maybe it's time for some fresh faces in leadership. Someone who understands the company's vision." Marcus knew exactly what this was. He had seen it before. Men like James who didn't need a real reason to push people like him out. Just a vague excuse wrapped in corporate jargon. He took a steadying breath. "James, I've dedicated years to this company. My performance has been consistent. If this is about the recent numbers, then I'd be happy to go over our strategies moving forward." James shook his head. "I don't think that will be necessary." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had worked too hard to be dismissed like this without cause. "You're firing me?" James shrugged, feigning sympathy. "Let's just say we're moving in a different direction." Marcus stood there for a long moment, debating his next move. He could fight this, but he knew how these things went. James would make it impossible for him to stay, no matter how much logic or reason he presented. Finally, Marcus gave a tight nod. "Fine." James smirked. "Glad you understand." Marcus turned on his heel and walked out, holding his head high. He wouldn't give James the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. But what James didn't know was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus walked out of the office, his fists clenched at his sides. He had seen men like James before, men who thought they could dismiss people like him without a second thought, without consequences. But he wasn't just going to roll over. He wasn't going to let years of hard work be erased by one man's prejudice. As he packed up his desk, his co-workers watched with cautious sympathy. Some offered quiet words of support, but none of them spoke out loud enough for James to hear. He understood why they were afraid. This wasn't just about him. It was about a system that let people like James get away with this kind of discrimination under the guise of restructuring. He wasn't even sure what his next step was yet, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to disappear quietly. Hours later, Marcus found himself at a cafe, sipping his coffee and scrolling through job listings on his phone. He had more than enough experience to land another position, but that wasn't the point. The injustice of it all burned in his chest. He wanted to do something, but what? His phone buzzed. A text from his sister, Layla. "Layla, heard what happened. You okay?" Marcus sighed and responded, "I will be." A few moments later, another text came through. "Layla, you need to talk to someone about this. Someone with real influence." Marcus frowned. "Like who?" Layla sent a picture, a flyer for an upcoming event in the city. "Women in leadership. A conversation with Oprah Winfrey. Marcus stared at it. Oprah, one of the most influential voices in the world. The kind of person who didn't just talk about change. She made it happen. But what were the chances of him actually getting to speak with her? Layla, what do you have to lose? Marcus exhaled. She was right. He had nothing left to lose. The night of the event, Marcus arrived at the venue, dressed in his best suit. The auditorium was packed, people buzzing with anticipation. Oprah was one of those figures who commanded a room just by walking into it. He needed to get close enough to tell his story. As she took the stage, the audience erupted into applause. She was poised, elegant, and radiated authority. She spoke about resilience, about overcoming obstacles, about fighting for what was right even when the odds were stacked against you. Every word resonated with Marcus. When the floor opened for questions, he raised his hand. He wasn't sure if he'd even be called on. There were hundreds of people here. But then, miraculously, Oprah's eyes landed on him. "You in the blue suit," she said. The mic was passed to him, and suddenly, the entire room was silent, waiting for him to speak. Marcus took a deep breath. "Ms. Winfrey, my name is Marcus Grant. 3 days ago, I was fired from my job. Not because of my performance, not because of anything I did wrong, but because my boss didn't think someone like me fit his vision of the company." There was a murmur in the crowd. Oprah's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean by someone like you?" Marcus met her gaze. A black man, professional, someone who didn't bend when he tried to push me down. The room tensed. Oprah tilted her head slightly. "And what did you do?" "I left," Marcus said. "But I don't think people like him should get away with this anymore." A slow nod from Oprah. "You're absolutely right." She turned to the audience. "This is exactly what we're talking about when we discuss systemic discrimination in the workplace. It's not just the outright acts. It's the quiet, insidious ones. The ones that happen behind closed doors, in vague conversations about company direction." And Marcus, he straightened. "You're not alone in this." Marcus felt something shift in the air. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. And James had no idea what was coming. The room fell into a deep silence, but it was not the kind of silence that signaled indifference. It was an anticipatory silence, the kind that meant people were listening. Oprah held the microphone firmly, her expression serious but filled with a deep understanding. She took a step forward on the stage, her heels clicking softly against the polished wooden floor. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying across the room with a quiet strength. "This isn't just about you losing a job. It's about something much bigger, isn't it?" Marcus swallowed, gripping the microphone in his hand. His palms were damp, but he refused to let his nerves show. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "It's about the thousands of people who deal with this every day. People who give everything to their jobs, only to be discarded because they don't fit some biased mold of what a leader looks like." A murmur rippled through the audience, the weight of his words settling in. Oprah nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right," she said. "And the question I have for you, Marcus, is, what are you going to do about it?" Marcus felt the breath in his lungs pause for a moment. What was he going to do? He had spent the last 3 days feeling angry, feeling wronged, but he hadn't considered what came next. Was he supposed to move on, find another job, pretend this never happened? Or was there another path, a better one? He straightened his shoulders. "I want to hold him accountable," Marcus said firmly. "I want people to know what happened so that it stops happening to others." A few people in the audience clapped, a slow, deliberate applause that quickly spread. Oprah smiled, pleased with his answer. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do." Marcus blinked, unsure of what she meant. Oprah turned to the crowd. "This is the part where people like to shake their heads and say, 'Oh, that's terrible,' and then move on with their lives. But what happens if we don't move on? What happens if we actually do something?" A wave of energy swept through the audience, a collective stirring as people nodded, whispered to one another, and felt the call to action. Oprah gestured to Marcus. "Marcus, I want you to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We're going to make sure that the world knows what happened to you." Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. The most influential woman in media was inviting him to sit down with her one-on-one. His heart pounded as he nodded. "I'll be there." The audience erupted into applause. That night, Marcus barely slept. His mind was a swirling storm of thoughts, emotions, and questions. He replayed the moment over and over in his head. Oprah looking at him, calling on him to act. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about something greater. It was about change. The next morning, he arrived at a sleek, modern office in the heart of the city. He was ushered into a conference room where Oprah was already seated, a tablet in front of her. She gestured for him to sit. "Before we start," she said, studying him closely, "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about putting your old boss on blast. If we do this, we're going to start a conversation, a real national conversation about discrimination in corporate spaces. This will be bigger than you. Are you ready for that?" Marcus exhaled. He had spent years working in silence, trying to prove himself to people like James. And where had that gotten him? Out the door, with nothing but a box of his belongings. No, he was done staying silent. "I'm ready," he said. Oprah nodded approvingly. "Then let's get to work." Over the next hour, they crafted the story, his story, a narrative that wasn't just about one man losing his job, but about the countless professionals who had faced the same thing. Then Oprah made the call. Within 24 hours, Marcus' story was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. It trended on Twitter. LinkedIn was flooded with professionals sharing their own experiences of bias in the workplace. People began demanding answers. Marcus' name was suddenly on everyone's lips, not as a man who was fired, but as a man who was leading a movement. And at the center of it all, James. The next morning, James arrived at his office, coffee in hand, already irritated. He had been receiving a flurry of emails and texts since last night, but he hadn't bothered to check them yet. His morning routine was sacred, and he wasn't about to let some corporate nonsense disrupt it. But the moment he stepped into his office, he knew something was wrong. His assistant, Kelly, was standing there, pale-faced, clutching her phone. "Sir," she stammered, "I think you should look at the news." James frowned, setting down his coffee. "What are you talking about?" He reached for his phone, but Kelly thrust hers in front of him instead. The screen displayed a news headline in bold letters. "Former employee speaks out against workplace discrimination." Backed by Oprah Winfrey. James' stomach dropped. He clicked on the article, his eyes scanning the words frantically. Marcus' name was right there, front and center. And worse, his name was too. James Cartwright, CEO of Cartwright & Company, is facing backlash after former employee Marcus Grant revealed details of a wrongful termination that echoes deeper issues of workplace discrimination. With Oprah Winfrey now advocating for systemic change in corporate hiring practices, the story has sparked a nationwide conversation about racial bias in the workplace. James froze. This wasn't just a small scandal. This was a disaster. His hands clenched into fists. He had underestimated Marcus. He had thought he was just another employee, easily replaced, easily forgotten. But now, his own reputation was on the line. Investors were mentioned in the article, some already calling for a review of company policies. This was spiraling out of control. Kelly's voice was small. "Sir, there are reporters outside." James' heart pounded. "Outside?" She nodded. "They've been here since this morning. The board is demanding a statement." James yanked on his tie, feeling a sudden tightness in his throat. This couldn't be happening. His career, his company, everything he had built, it was all at risk because of Marcus. His phone buzzed. A message from an anonymous board member. "Fix this. Now." James swallowed hard. Marcus had been just another employee to him. A nobody. But now Marcus was the most powerful person in the room. And James? James was the one begging to be heard. James stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to collect his thoughts. This couldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening. How had Marcus managed to turn the situation around so quickly? How had he gotten Oprah Winfrey involved? He sank into his chair, rubbing his temples as his phone continued to buzz with messages from panicked board members. His company was in chaos. Investors were pulling back, clients were threatening to walk, and now the media was circling like vultures. Kelly knocked hesitantly at the door. "Sir, the board is expecting you in 15 minutes for an emergency meeting." James exhaled sharply. He wasn't ready for this, but he didn't have a choice. 15 minutes later, he stepped into the glass-walled conference room, facing a room full of furious executives. The tension was suffocating. The chairman of the board, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, wasted no time. "James," he began, his voice cold, "explain how in the last 24 hours, this company has gone from an industry leader to the center of a national controversy." James stiffened. "This is being blown out of proportion. It's one disgruntled employee trying to make noise." "Disgruntled?" One of the board members scoffed. "Oprah Winfrey doesn't back disgruntled employees, James. She backs movements. Do you understand what you've done?" James opened his mouth to respond, but another board member cut in. "Do you know how many major investors have already pulled out this morning? We are bleeding money, and unless you find a way to fix this, you're going to cost us the company." James felt a chill creep down his spine. "I can fix it," he said quickly. "We release a statement. We tell the media that Marcus was let go due to performance issues, not discrimination." The chairman's gaze darkened. "Are you even listening to yourself? If we try to discredit him now, it will only make things worse. He already has public support. You don't." James clenched his fists. This was his company, his legacy, and now it was slipping through his fingers. "What do you suggest I do?" he asked through gritted teeth. The chairman leaned forward. "You apologize." James' entire body went rigid. "Apologize?" The word tasted bitter on his tongue. "Yes," the chairman said. "A full public apology. You take responsibility. You offer Marcus compensation. And you announce immediate changes to our hiring and leadership policies." James hated every word of it. Apologizing to Marcus? The thought made his skin crawl. But he wasn't in control anymore. He had lost his leverage. And that's when it hit him. Marcus had won. Meanwhile, Marcus sat across from Oprah in a quiet meeting room. The day had been a whirlwind. Interviews, news segments, and now a sit-down discussion about what came next. Oprah studied him carefully. "You have a platform now, Marcus. What do you want to do with it?" Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I don't just want an apology," he said firmly. "I want change." Oprah smiled knowingly. "Good answer." Over the next hour, they strategized. They talked about long-term impact, about setting up corporate accountability programs, and about ensuring that what happened to Marcus wouldn't happen to others. Then Oprah's assistant stepped in with a note. Marcus took it, reading it quickly, his eyebrows raised. "James wants to meet with me?" Oprah leaned back, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Of course he does. He's desperate." Marcus exhaled. He had no interest in sitting down with James. But then again, maybe this was an opportunity. The next morning, James sat in his office, his foot tapping anxiously against the floor. He had agreed to a private meeting with Marcus before issuing his public statement. He needed to contain the damage. The door opened, and Marcus walked in. For the first time since firing him, James actually looked at Marcus. And what he saw unnerved him. Marcus wasn't bitter. He wasn't defeated. He looked powerful. James stood. "Marcus," he greeted, forcing a tight smile. "Glad you came." Marcus didn't return the smile. He took a seat, folding his hands in front of him. "Let's not waste time, James. Why did you ask to meet?" James hesitated. "Look, he struggled to say the words. "I made a mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" James clenched his jaw. "Yes." Marcus tilted his head. "No, James. A mistake is forgetting to send an email. What you did was a choice. You chose to fire me not because of my work, but because you didn't want someone like me in a leadership role." James' jaw tightened. "That's not." Save it, Marcus cut him off. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to hear what you're actually going to do to fix this. James exhaled sharply. We're implementing new diversity policies. We're restructuring our hiring and promotion processes. And he forced himself to say it. We want you to come back. Marcus blinked. That he hadn't expected. Excuse me? James cleared his throat. You've become a symbol, Marcus. If you return, it will show that we're actually committed to change. Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Then he chuckled. So you think I should help you clean up your mess? James' face flushed. I think it's an opportunity. Marcus stood, smoothing out his suit. You don't get it, do you, James? I don't need your company anymore. James stiffened. You're really walking away from this? Marcus looked him straight in the eye. I'm walking towards something better. James watched as Marcus turned and walked out, his head held high. And for the first time in his life, James realized that power wasn't about titles. It was about who people chose to follow. And Marcus had the world behind him. Marcus walked out of James' office with an overwhelming sense of finality. For years, he had dedicated himself to that company, believing that if he worked hard enough, if he kept his head down and pushed through, he would be recognized. But the truth was, people like James had never planned on giving him a seat at the table. And that was their loss. Stepping into the fresh air, Marcus took a deep breath. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Another email, another interview request, another opportunity. He had been invited to speak at a national diversity and leadership conference in 2 weeks. The thought sent a rush of excitement through him. This was bigger than him now. He had a platform, and he wasn't going to waste it. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, he reflected on everything that had happened. The messages pouring in from professionals all over the country were overwhelming. Stories from people who had been pushed aside, overlooked, dismissed. People who had worked twice as hard only to receive half the recognition. It wasn't just his fight anymore. Marcus picked up his phone and called Oprah's office. A few minutes later, her assistant patched him through. Marcus, Oprah's warm voice filled the line. I had a feeling you'd call. Marcus let out a small chuckle. I want to do more. Oprah didn't hesitate. Then let's make it happen. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. Marcus prepared for the conference, met with activists, and even received calls from major corporations asking for consulting advice on how to fix their diversity problems. It was surreal. The same industry that had shut him out was now seeking his expertise. Meanwhile, James was drowning. The fallout from Marcus' story had only escalated. Protesters had started gathering outside his company headquarters. A petition calling for his resignation had gathered over 100,000 signatures in less than a week. Investors were demanding reassurance, and employees inside the company were leaking information about other incidents of discrimination. James had gone from CEO to scapegoat. In a last-ditch effort, he announced a live press conference. The conference room was packed with journalists. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered amongst themselves as James approached the podium. He cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the stand. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair neatly combed, but there was something about his demeanor, the stiffness in his jaw, the tightness in his grip, that revealed the cracks in his confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carefully measured. I want to take this opportunity to address the recent controversy surrounding my company. Silence fell over the room. First and foremost, I take full responsibility for the events that have unfolded. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. I deeply regret the actions that led to the dismissal of Mr. Marcus Grant. I now understand that my decisions were rooted in biases that should have no place in the corporate world. A murmur ran through the crowd. Effective immediately, James continued, I am stepping down as CEO of Cartwright & Company. A wave of shock rippled through the audience. Journalists scrambled to take notes. James inhaled sharply, his shoulders tense. This company needs to move forward with leadership that reflects the values we claim to stand for. It is my hope that this decision will allow Cartwright & Company to rebuild its reputation and create an inclusive environment for all employees. The room exploded with questions. Mr. Cartwright, What will you do next? Do you believe you were treated unfairly in this situation? Have you spoken to Marcus Grant since his departure? James ignored them all. He had lost, and for the first time in his life, he knew it. The news broke within minutes. Social media exploded. The once powerful CEO had been forced out, his downfall a direct result of his own actions. Marcus watched the announcement on his phone, sitting backstage at the conference where he was scheduled to speak. He exhaled slowly, processing the moment. James was gone, but Marcus wasn't here to celebrate his downfall. He was here to build something better. A voice cut through his thoughts. "We're ready for you, Marcus." He nodded, standing up. His heart pounded as he walked onto the stage, greeted by the thunderous applause of thousands. Taking his place at the podium, he looked out into the sea of faces. And then he spoke. "I spent years of my life believing that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved myself, I would be given a chance. But the truth is, people like me are expected to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. And even then, we're still told we don't belong." The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. "But what happened to me was not just about me," he continued. "This is about all of us, about every person who has been overlooked, undervalued, dismissed. And I am here today to tell you, we are done waiting for seats at the table." A ripple of agreement moved through the audience. "We are building our own tables," Marcus said, his voice rising. "We are creating our own spaces. And we are making sure that the next generation never has to beg for an opportunity that should have been theirs in the first place." The applause was deafening. And at that moment, Marcus knew he had won. Not because James had lost his job, not because the world had finally seen what he had endured, but because he had transformed his pain into power. And he wasn't stopping anytime soon. As Marcus stepped down from the stage, he was met with cheers, handshakes, and tears from people who saw themselves in his story. Industry leaders, students, and activists surrounded him, eager to discuss what came next. The energy was electric, but Marcus knew that inspiration wasn't enough. Action had to follow. That night, he met with a team of corporate reform advocates, legal experts, and diversity officers. Together, they began outlining the next steps. Marcus didn't just want to speak at events. He wanted to create lasting impact. The first initiative was straightforward: a nationwide mentorship program for marginalized employees in corporate spaces, giving them direct access to training, networking, and leadership opportunities. Marcus wanted to ensure that no one had to fight the same battles alone. Within days, his program gained traction. Major corporations reached out, eager to participate in a public relations move to rebuild their own images. But Marcus wasn't interested in companies looking for a quick fix. He wanted real change. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding James Cartwright's resignation had not died down. Some business analysts praised his decision to step down, while others saw it as nothing more than a calculated move to save face. Either way, Cartwright and company was struggling to recover. Former employees began coming forward with stories about the company's toxic culture. A class action lawsuit was even filed by several past employees who had faced similar discrimination under James' leadership. For Marcus, watching it unfold felt surreal. The same company that had once tried to erase him was now crumbling under its own weight. And then came an unexpected call. Marcus was sitting in his new office, an actual corner office, this time in a company where he was respected, when his phone buzzed. James Cartwright. Marcus hesitated before answering. "Marcus." James' voice was quieter than he remembered. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "James." A long silence stretched between them. "I didn't call to make excuses," James finally said. I wanted to say that I understand now. I didn't before. And I know that doesn't fix anything. But I needed you to know." Marcus exhaled slowly. "It doesn't fix anything. But I hope, for your sake, that you truly mean that." James sighed. "What are you going to do next?" Marcus smiled to himself. "Build something better." James chuckled dryly. "I figured you'd say that." Another pause. "Good luck, Marcus." "You too, James." And that was it. Hanging up, Marcus stared out of his window. The city skyline stretched before him, But he wasn't looking at buildings. He was looking at possibilities. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to wait for an opportunity. He was creating them. And the future? The future was his to shape. Marcus sat in his office, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face as he sifted through the overwhelming number of emails flooding his inbox. His story had spread like wildfire, reaching people far beyond the corporate world. Messages came from aspiring professionals, civil rights advocates, and even CEOs of major companies who claimed they wanted to learn from their mistakes. It was an odd feeling being sought after by the same kind of people who, just months ago, would have ignored him completely. His phone buzzed. A message from Oprah. "I have an idea. Call me when you can." Marcus didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he was on a video call with Oprah herself. She sat in her home office, wearing reading glasses and flipping through a thick binder filled with notes. "You've created a movement, Marcus," she said, getting straight to the point. "The work you're doing, it's bigger than just consulting companies or speaking at events." Marcus nodded, already anticipating where she was going. "I want us to build something long-term, not just a program, but a full-scale initiative, a leadership pipeline, corporate accountability measures, a system that doesn't just call out discrimination, but replaces it with something better." Marcus' heart pounded. The thought of leading a nationwide initiative with Oprah Winfrey was overwhelming, but deep down, he knew it was exactly what needed to happen. "We'll need the right people," he said, already thinking of activists, legal experts, and corporate insiders who had reached out in recent weeks. Oprah smiled. "I've already started making calls." Meanwhile, James Cartwright was drowning in backlash. His company's stock had plummeted, key executives had resigned, and multiple lawsuits were underway. He had become a cautionary tale, the face of corporate racism getting what it deserved. Marcus smiled. He knew that this was only the beginning. As the official launch of EquityWorks approached, Marcus could feel the weight of what they had built. This wasn't just a company. It was a statement, a direct challenge to the corporate world. Every policy, every decision, every aspect of its structure had been deliberately designed to counteract the discrimination and exclusion that people like Marcus had spent years battling. The press was relentless, covering the rise of EquityWorks and the unbelievable transformation of James Cartwright. Some reporters still questioned his sincerity, wondering if this was simply a calculated PR stunt. Others saw it as an unprecedented shift in corporate leadership, something never done before at this level. Marcus, however, wasn't concerned with the headlines. He was focused on action. A week before the launch, Marcus and James sat in the conference room, going over the final logistics. Every executive they had brought on board had been vetted for their commitment to EquityWorks values. Their funding was secured, and their first round of hires would include individuals who had previously been rejected by corporate spaces due to systemic biases. James tapped his pen against the table. "Do you ever think about where we started?" he asked. Marcus smirked. "Every day." James let out a breath. "I used to think leadership was about power, about control. I built an empire on that belief. And look how that turned out." Marcus folded his arms. "So what do you think now?" James thought for a moment before answering. "I think real leadership is about building people up, not tearing them down." For the first time, Marcus believed him. Launch day arrived. The event was held in a massive auditorium, packed with executives, activists, and young professionals hoping to be part of something historic. The energy was electric. Oprah took the stage first, delivering an opening speech that set the tone for the day. "We are not here to celebrate one man's downfall," she said, her voice commanding. "We are here to celebrate what happens when people choose to be better. When they refuse to accept that injustice is just the way things are. When they stand up and demand change, and then go out and create it." The applause was thunderous. Marcus took the stage next, feeling a rush of adrenaline as he stepped up to the microphone. "There was a time when I thought I had to fight this battle alone," he began. "That if I just worked hard enough, if I just kept my head down, I could make it. But I learned the hard way that the problem was never me. It was the system." He looked out at the crowd, at the thousands of eyes locked onto him. That's why we built Equity Works. Not as a business, not as a brand, but as a revolution. The crowd erupted. James spoke last. It was a risk having him speak at all. Many still weren't ready to trust him. But Marcus knew that growth meant accountability, and James needed to own his past. James stepped up to the podium, exhaling slowly before he spoke. "A year ago, I fired a man for nothing more than my own prejudice," he said, his voice steady. "I sat in an office built on privilege and told myself that I had earned everything I had. That anyone who wasn't like me just wasn't trying hard enough." The room was silent, but I was wrong, and I see that now. I can't erase what I did. I can't undo the harm I caused. But I can spend the rest of my life making sure no one else has to go through what Marcus did. There was a pause, a moment of hesitation. Then, slowly, the crowd began to applaud. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't thunderous. But it was real. Marcus watched as James stepped back from the podium, his face unreadable. But Marcus could see it. The shift, the transformation. James Cartwright was not the same man he had been a year ago. And that, Marcus realized, was proof that change was possible. That this was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Equity Works made waves. Major companies started adopting their accountability models, mentorship programs were launched nationwide, and employees across industries began demanding better. Marcus became a household name, invited to speak on major platforms, from universities to corporate summits. But no matter how big the movement got, he always came back to the same mission: to build a future where no one had to fight just to be seen. James, too, continued his journey. He stepped back from leadership to focus on advocacy, working with organizations to dismantle the corporate biases he had once perpetuated. He didn't expect forgiveness. He knew that wasn't the point. The point was the work. One evening, Marcus received an email from a young professional. "I used to think there was no place for someone like me in the corporate world. But because of you, because of Equity Works, I believe there's a place for me now. Thank you." Marcus smiled. He closed his laptop and looked out the window at the city skyline, at the endless possibilities. This was more than just a victory. This was a new beginning. And the future? The future was theirs to shape. For the first time in his life, James was completely powerless. Sitting in his now half-empty office, he scrolled through article after article about his downfall. Social media was merciless. People mocked his press conference, exposed his company's history of unethical practices, and called for harsher consequences. And the worst part? No one was coming to save him. He had built his entire career on the illusion of power, surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. Now, those same people were jumping ship, scrambling to distance themselves from him. He gritted his teeth, tossing his phone onto his desk. For the first time, he wondered, had he actually been wrong all this time? 2 weeks later, Marcus and Oprah's initiative, the Future Leaders Project, was officially launched. The initiative was designed to do 3 things. 1. Mentorship and leadership development, pairing marginalized professionals with industry leaders who would advocate for them, not just guide them. 2. Corporate reform, providing third-party oversight for companies claiming to support diversity, forcing them to back up their statements with action. 3. Public accountability, creating a platform where workers could expose discriminatory practices and push for systemic change. The response was overwhelming. Within the first week, over 500 major companies had signed up, agreeing to participate in leadership training and transparency audits. But Marcus knew that real change wasn't going to come from press releases. It was going to come from constant pressure, constant accountability, and a refusal to accept performative gestures. At the launch event, Marcus stood beside Oprah as she addressed a packed audience, cameras flashing, news stations broadcasting the event live. "We are here today," Oprah said, "not just to demand better, but to create better. This is not just about changing a few hiring policies. This is about reshaping the entire corporate landscape." The audience erupted into applause. Marcus stepped forward, taking a deep breath before speaking. "For years, people like me have been told to just work harder, to just prove ourselves. But the truth is, we were never the problem. The system was another round of applause. And so, starting today, we are building our own system. One where talent is recognized without bias. One where the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we did. As Marcus spoke, he locked eyes with James Cartwright, sitting in the back of the room. James had come. Marcus hadn't invited him, but he had shown up anyway. And something about the look on his face told Marcus that, for the first time, he was actually listening. After the event, Marcus found himself standing near the exit, shaking hands with attendees who wanted to congratulate him. Some of them were young professionals, hopeful that this initiative would change the industry. Others were executives from major corporations, eager to prove they were on board with the movement. And then James Cartwright stepped forward. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened between them hung in the air. James, once the untouchable CEO of a corporate giant, now looked exhausted. The arrogance that once radiated from him was gone. He extended a hand. "Marcus," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Marcus stared at the hand, remembering how this same man had once dismissed him without a second thought. But then, he looked into James' eyes and saw something he hadn't before. Uncertainty, maybe even regret. He shook his hand. "I wasn't expecting you to come," Marcus said. James let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Honestly, neither was I." Silence stretched between them. Then James sighed. "Look, I don't expect forgiveness. I know I screwed up, and maybe it's too late, but I wanted to listen. Really listen." Marcus crossed his arms. "And what exactly are you hoping to hear?" James glanced around at the bustling event, at the corporate executives who were now rushing to align themselves with Marcus' vision. "I guess I just want to understand," he admitted. "I spent my whole career thinking that the way things were was just how they were supposed to be. But now I see that maybe I was part of the problem." Marcus studied him carefully. He had heard too many executives claim to be waking up to the issues of discrimination, only to turn around and do the bare minimum for damage control. But James? He looked different. "Are you saying you want to be part of the solution?" Marcus asked. James hesitated. "I don't know if I deserve to be." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's a start." A week later, Marcus found himself sitting across from James in a private meeting. It was strange, being on equal ground with a man who once held power over his entire career. James leaned forward. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I built, the environment I created at Cartwright and Company. And I've come to realize that company is beyond saving. The culture is too ingrained, too toxic. It needs to be torn down." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "So what are you saying?" James exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "I want to start over. But this time, I don't want to build another empire that shuts people out. I want to create something new, something that actually puts diversity and fairness first. But I can't do it alone." Marcus sat back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. "You want my help?" he asked, skepticism clear in his voice. James gave a half-smile. "I want to learn from my mistakes, and I know that I have a long way to go before I earn anyone's trust. But I figured if I'm going to start over, I should learn from someone who got it right." Marcus studied him. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to remember the power imbalance that once defined their relationship. But at the same time, if someone like James, someone who had once embodied the system's failures, was truly willing to change, could this be an opportunity to reshape what corporate leadership looked like? He let out a slow breath. "If we do this," Marcus said, "we do it the right way. No half measures. No empty promises." James nodded. Agreed. And just like that, an unlikely partnership was formed. As weeks passed, Marcus and James began assembling a team of business leaders, advocates, and reformists. They drafted plans for a new kind of company, one that didn't just claim to be inclusive but built equity into its foundation. For Marcus, it was about creating access, mentorship programs, transparent hiring practices, and leadership opportunities for those who had always been overlooked. For James, it was about redemption, not just for himself, but for an entire industry that had long failed to evolve. And as they worked, something unexpected happened. James listened. He sat in meetings with Black professionals, women, LGBTQ+ leaders, and people with disabilities, hearing their stories, understanding their struggles. And rather than argue or deflect, he took notes. He asked questions. He absorbed everything. And slowly, people who once loathed him began to see something they never expected. Growth. Real, tangible growth. As their new company, Equity Works, prepared for its launch, Marcus received a message from Oprah. "This is bigger than I ever imagined. Let's talk."